The wedding cake was still warm. They posed beneath a canopy of white flowers, smiles fixed for photographs. Outside, guests laughed and lifted glasses for toasts. Inside, behind a closed door and the theater of celebration, there were secrets that would not stay hidden. Within months, newsrooms would be interrupting broadcasts. Families would be unmoored by grief. A country would be forced to ask how such ordinary, sunlit moments could sit beside the most unspeakable betrayals. Please help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. This is the story of a honeymoon that belonged on a magazine spread, and a headline that would not let the country look away. A story of the small, everyday things that mask monstrous cruelty, and the legal bargains that would haunt a nation long after the cheers had faded. On paper, Karla and Paul were an unlikely pair, the kind of couple that could appear in a human interest piece. Young, attractive, newly married, moving through neighborhoods with rehearsed normalcy. Karla Homolka was known in her community as a pretty, soft-spoken young woman. Paul Bernardo presented as charming, confident, and, to the casual acquaintance, successful. They moved through family events, classrooms, shopping trips, the texture of a life most viewers would recognize. But underneath that ordinary surface, a darker architecture of control and violence developed. Over a narrow, terrible stretch at the end of the 1980s and into the early 1990s, a series of disappearances and deaths would stitch together a bleak pattern. Young girls gone missing, communities on edge, and the slow discovery of evidence that would shock a nation. Among the victims was Tammy Homolka, Karla's younger sister, whose death in December of 1990 would initially be ruled an accident before later becoming the focal point of renewed police scrutiny. 2 other young women, beloved daughters, students, friends would be taken in the years that followed, and their names became impossible to forget. Mahaffy and Kristen French, teenagers with lives still unfolding, vanished and were later found, bringing into public light not only the acts themselves, but also the painstaking and painful work of the investigation that found them. When the scope of what had happened came into view, it did so clumsily and painfully. Investigators dug through what had once been private rooms. Families were forced to relive details in public. For journalists, these stories were headline after headline. For politicians, the case posed soul-searching questions about the adequacy of policing and the role of prosecutors. For ordinary people, the jarring juxtaposition of wedding photos and police tape left a bitter sense of disorientation. How could smiling faces and Christmas lights be the same backdrop for such cruelty? And when evidence surfaced that tied images and recordings to the crimes, a second shock followed. The legal machinery that would process those images, how they were collected, when they were disclosed, and the decisions made by prosecutors would itself become a subject of outrage and debate. The plea bargain that prosecutors made with Karla Homolka, a deal that would spare her the most severe charges in exchange for her cooperation, would later be cast as one of the most controversial prosecutorial choices in Canadian history. The optics of that bargain, set against the gravity of the crimes it related to, ignited public fury and left many victims' families feeling robbed of justice. This is not a tale of black and white monsters and saints. It is a study in small betrayals amplified of trust twisted back upon those least able to fight. It is a story about investigative patience and missteps, about the power of recorded evidence and the fraught choices of the courtroom. Above all, it is a story about the lives taken and the families who must live with absence. We owe them a careful, human account. The first blow that would later be understood as part of this pattern came one winter night in 1990. A teenage girl, bright, full of ordinary small joys, died in her family home. The initial medical findings suggested an accident, choking after consuming alcohol and medication. The family grieved with the quiet fervor of a private sorrow. The death certificate and the way the medical examiner recorded the event framed the day as tragedy without malice. Later, as patterns emerged and investigators revisited old evidence with new eyes, that night took on a different and darker meaning. The death that had been called an accident was reclassified as the first in a series of criminal acts. Friends and family, scrambling to reconcile their memories with the truth, found themselves rereading casual conversations and holiday photos for clues that were never meant to be there. The subsequent disappearances were even more chilling. Teenage girls, ordinary in their routines, stepping into a backyard, dropping off homework, stopping to talk at the corner, vanished. In one case, neighbors remembered laughter and the rustle of an evening breeze. In another, the hum of a television and the clatter of cutlery. Each family's ordinary life was ripped open and examined. When human remains were found months later in a place where fishermen and passers-by had once relaxed and tossed lines into the lake, the country reeled. The bodies, the loss, were cataloged in forensic reports and headlines, but for the families they were always a daughter, a sister, a friend. The discovery of those remains transformed missing persons cases into murder investigations and sent police racing to connect threads that, until then, had lain scattered. Perhaps the most disturbing dimension of these crimes, a fact that would define both public reaction and the legal aftermath, was the existence of recorded material. Investigators eventually uncovered videotapes that documented some of the crimes, a reality that craned the tragedy into the public eye in a way that images alone cannot. These tapes, their content, and their chain of custody would become central to both public outrage and prosecutorial decisions. The moral questions raised by recording violence, and how those recordings are used in court, haunted every step that followed. Throughout this period, communities lived under the specter of fear. Parents kept doors locked in a way they had not before. School corridors that once echoed with adolescent chatter became routes of heightened vigilance. And in the tight little towns and suburbs where everyone seemed to know everyone, suspicion spread like frost. You looked at your neighbor differently. You questioned the ordinary. Investigations rarely arrive as a single, elegant sweep. They are slow, sometimes clumsy, often the product of officers working under immense pressure and with limited resources. This investigation was no exception. It proceeded in stages: tips and leads, desk research and door-to-door canvassing, forensic analysis and courtroom strategy. At first, the unusual was chalked up to coincidence. The early death was an outlier. The later disappearances initiated missing persons reports, and police followed standard protocols. But as days stretched into weeks and clues began to braid together, a shared acquaintance here, a timeline that overlapped there, the net tightened. Police reopened files. Questions were asked about what had or hadn't been pursued months earlier. A jolt came when a family member, racked by guilt or fear or honesty, initiated a conversation that altered the course of the case. Statements that had once been casual now mattered in the way only hindsight permits. Forensic science, at its most clinical, began to do its work. Evidence collected from scenes, from vehicles, from clothing, and from properties was cataloged and analyzed. DNA testing, fingerprints, and timelines began to pin the suspects to places and moments. The work was painstaking. Hours in the lab, late-night reviews of old notes, and the slow accumulation of proof that could stand up in court. In many ways, the case became a study in how modern policing combines scientific rigor with the slow, interpersonal labor of interviews and witness statements. One of the most consequential moments in the investigation came with the discovery of videotapes and other recordings that documented aspects of the crimes. The existence of that evidence had two immediate impacts. First, it provided prosecutors with direct and disturbing confirmation of wrongdoing. Second, and perhaps more controversially, it required decisions about disclosure, chain of custody, and how such material should be introduced in criminal proceedings. Those decisions would ripple outward, shaping plea negotiations and public trust. Arrest followed arrest. Evidence was presented to judges. The court of public opinion, ever hungry for detail, followed along in newspapers and evening broadcasts. When the accused were brought into custody, the questions didn't stop. Had the police done enough earlier? Were their leads missed? Could more have been done to prevent the subsequent tragedies? Throughout the investigation, families were forced into the uncomfortable role of participants in a public process. They sat in courtrooms as strangers and reporters watched. They fielded calls from national media. They relived shock after shock in hearings and interviews. For many, the process of investigation was not a search for closure so much as a drawn-out exposure to the machinery of criminal justice, with all its necessities and cruelties. And then came the prosecutor's strategic calculus. Who would be charged with what, how best to secure convictions, and whether deals should be offered in exchange for cooperation. These are the calculations that courts require, where the value of testimony and the weight of evidence are measured against the ideal of full retribution. In this case, the resulting plea bargain, an agreement that led to a lesser conviction for one of the accused in exchange for testimony, would become one of the most contentious and debated decisions of the entire saga. Critics said it shortchanged justice. Proponents argued it was necessary to win convictions that otherwise might never have been secured. The ambiguity of that decision would haunt the families and the nation. The courtroom delivered its verdicts, and the legal outcomes were decisive, though not universally satisfying. One of the accused was tried, convicted of first-degree murder and other grave offenses, and received a life sentence. That sentence was intended to reflect both the brutality of the crimes and the society's need to protect itself from repeat harm. For many observers, the severity of the sentence offered a degree of moral clarity, a plain statement that certain harms provoke the strongest possible institutional response. The other accused entered a negotiated plea in exchange for cooperation and testimony against the primary defendant. A deal was struck that resulted in a conviction on lesser charges and a significantly shorter term of incarceration. The bargain was legal, common in many jurisdictions, and at the time it offered prosecutors a route to secure a conviction against the person they believed to be principally responsible for the worst acts. Yet the deal left a gulf between legal strategy and emotional justice. Families of victims and many members of the public expressed outrage, unable to reconcile the scale of the crimes with what they saw as an inadequate punishment. The images of wedding photos and the memory of earlier smiles made the bargain all the more bitter for many. When the person who had taken the plea completed the agreed sentence and was released, the reaction was explosive. Protests, anger, and a renewed public debate about prosecutorial discretion followed. The release prompted lawmakers, commentators, and citizens to question whether the legal system had adequately accounted for victims' rights and the public's need for a sense of proportional justice. Some argued that the prosecution had acted in good faith, believing that witness cooperation was necessary for the larger convictions. Others contended that the deal was a tragic miscalculation, offering clemency that the seriousness of the crimes could not justify. Meanwhile, the convicted primary offender remained incarcerated. Over the years, parole hearings and requests for review would be met with resistance, and victim impact statements filled with grief and the kind of personal testimony the courtroom rarely contains would be read aloud, reminding the public that the toll of the crimes is not measured solely by years in a cell. News reports over successive years documented repeated parole denials and ongoing legal limbo for the incarcerated offender. But sentences and hearings are only part of an aftermath that extends into lives and communities. Families who lost daughters and sisters lived in a prolonged state of rearranged normalcy. Anniversaries passed with empty chairs, birthdays marked with memory, new seasons without a familiar voice. The trauma of public attention compounded private grief, and for many the healing, if it ever came, remained incomplete. At the societal level, the case sparked introspection about prosecutorial practices, evidence disclosure, and the ethics of negotiating plea deals when recording evidence exists that might otherwise lead to harsher convictions. It also pushed calls for better victim support systems, changes in investigative procedure, and reforms in how such cases are handled in the media to minimize re-traumatization. Some communities organized memorials and advocacy efforts, determined to channel grief into policy changes and public education. Others created scholarships or small community projects in memory of the lives lost, a stubborn attempt to grow something life-affirming from the soil of tragedy. There is a small, cruel arithmetic to stories like this. Two worlds that ought never to meet, The ordinary and the monstrous are forced to coexist under the same roofs. And when they do, the consequences ripple outward. Families are shattered, communities anxious, institutions questioned. What do we hold on to when the legal system gives us a verdict that satisfies the ledger but not the heart? What do we do when prosecutors promise safety but leave unanswered the deeper moral wounds of those who have lost so much? These questions do not yield easy answers. The law is a structure designed to balance proof and pragmatism, to choose between impossible trade-offs in the pursuit of convictions that will hold up in court. Yet justice, in any full sense, is more than a sentence. It is also memory, accountability, and a collective responsibility to the vulnerable. If there is a lesson, perhaps it is this: vigilance matters, not only in policing, but in the small daily acts of community care. When a family member's oddness is explained away rather than asked about. When a neighborhood keeps silent rather than speaks up. When the machinery of justice must choose between the damning clarity of recorded horror and the promise of cooperation. Those moments accumulate, and the choices made in them shape whether a headline will be a warning or a wound. This story about a honeymoon that would become a headline is, above all, a human story. It is about girls who should have grown into lives we never saw. It is about families who grieve holidays that never end. It is about a society that must look at itself in the mirror and decide how to respond the next time ordinary life and shadowed cruelty cross paths. If you take nothing else from this episode, listen for the voices that remain, the quieter ones in courtrooms, the photographs on mantles, the names that communities place on memorial stones. They are the true ledger of loss. And in remembering them carefully and respectfully, we honor the fragile value of a life that should never have been cut short.